You're listening to The Briefing, first broadcast on the 13th of December 2024 on Monocle Radio. Hello and welcome to The Briefing, coming to you live from Studio 2 here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Muller. Coming up on today's programme.
I'm Simon Bouvier, Monocle's Paris Bureau Chief, and today we'll be talking about France's brand new Prime Minister, François Bayrou.
Later in the show, Chanel names a new creative director. Also ahead, Morocco celebrates record tourist numbers, and we'll wrap up the latest news in the arts and...
I've spent a lot of time in Malaysia with my family out there. A very long time ago, I just started buying records at the bottom of department stores in basement bins.
We'll meet the DJ and curator Alice Whittington, who'll introduce her new compilation of Southeast Asian pop of the 1970s and 1980s. That's all coming up right here on The Briefing on Monocle Radio. Welcome to today's edition of The Briefing with me, Andrew Muller. French President Emmanuel Macron has named his choice of new Prime Minister after an unnecessary amount of the kind of last-minute uncertainty nobody really needs when trying to write radio scripts shortly before going live. France's new Prime Minister is to be François Bayrou, long-serving mayor of Pau and founder and leader of the Democratic Movement Party. Bayrou is a 73-year-old centrist, widely perceived as a safe pair of hands, but exactly that description fits his predecessor, Michel Barnier, who lasted 3 months, and it seems far from certain that Bayrou will beat that. Well, joining me now in the studio is Monocle's Paris Bureau Chief and, who knows, the next Prime Minister of France, Simon Bouvier.
You never know.
Oh, well, they could do worse. We should, I guess, talk about, first of all, who this is while he's still here. He should just about last to the end of the programme, so I think we're reasonably safe. Basically, who is he?
Well, yes, so he should make it till the end of the program, I hope, at least for his sake. But he's a bit of a household name in French politics. He ran for president unsuccessfully 3 times. So the French know who he is. He has been a supporter of President Macron's for a long time. He was one of the architects of his successful 2017 presidential campaign. But he's also known as somebody who is very politically malleable. He makes a point of being a centrist, and he makes a virtue out of it, but he has been criticized for putting personal ambition ahead of kind of political backbone in the past. And also he has the added baggage of representing continuity with the very unpopular policies of President Macron. So he has a lot of baggage, and he's a bit he's certainly unpopular. I think we can say that, but that's not the point.
But see, a great deal, indeed, if not all of that, could have been applied absolutely accurately to his predecessor, Michel Barnier. So is there any reason at all that we are not going to be having this conversation again sometime in February?
I think there is a significant difference. The approach and how he was kind of selected very vertically by Macron, just holding consultations and deciding to take charge of the process instead of giving parliamentarians a bigger role in this, is the same. So the method is the same, but the strategy is quite different. Before, he made the bet that naming Barnier, who was considered, as you say, a safe pair of hands, but who was decidedly to the right of the president's party, who was not a part of the kind of centrist presidential coalition, and with the tacit support of the far right, was that was kind of the plan the first time around. And so now that they saw that it failed, the first objective of Macron and his allies was to create a government or name a head of government that would not be dependent on the far right's yay or nay. And so now, the German-style coalitions of, the center and the moderate right and the moderate left was always going to be out of reach because of how unpopular the president is. But the idea here is that Bayrou is centrist enough that he's going to be able, on a kind of bill-by-bill basis, to build different majorities for different texts in Parliament and go and fish for votes on the right for bills on immigration, for instance, and then the left left will be upset about that. But then maybe the left will be supportive of measures that have to do with retirement reform. But the right will be upset about that. The only idea is that there will not be any censorship from the outset. And that's kind of the lowest common denominator approach that we're taking now is, can we get all of the mainstream political forces to agree not to censure this government? They could still say they're upset. They could still vote against certain bills, but don't kick the government out. That's the objective.
I mean, does Bayrou not face the same fundamental problem, though, that Barnier did and whoever else might be next will, in that there is a hefty plurality of the National Assembly which seems much more interested in screwing things up for the president than it does in actually governing?
Yeah, I think that equation has not changed. There is one factor in that equation that has changed a little bit, which is that the unity in the kind of constellation of left-leaning parties called the Nouveau Front Populaire was holding together, or has been holding together since the early elections of the summer. And now I think that the most centrists of those forces, the Socialist Party, which is also one of the largest in that constellation, is having second thoughts about this our way or the highway approach. And so that's what the president is banking on, that the socialists will voice their dissatisfaction at some of the policies and bills that Bayrou's government will try to pass, but they will not censor the government outright.
Just finally on Macron, who is still president until 2027 and has insisted that one way that any future deadlocks will not be broken is by him resigning. He is just back from Poland. He has been talking to the Poles about the prospect of sending some sort of peacekeeping force to Ukraine if some sort of deal is done. Does it seem at this point that he is much more concerned, and not unreasonably, given that it's a big part of the French president's job, but he's much more concerned with matters foreign than domestic?
Absolutely. I think that he recognizes that the current makeup of the Assemblée Nationale means that for the remainder of his term, he's going to be essentially sidelined from domestic policymaking. That's just a fact. He is politically radioactive at home at the moment, which is why nobody wants to be affiliated with a government that represents continuity of the old world. So he has to focus on foreign policy now, and I think that's why you'll see him redoubling his efforts. Common defense, European kind of solidarity, stepping up to the plate and not relying so much on American military assistance has been one of his pet issues from the beginning. I think you'll definitely see him, especially with the war in Ukraine and the arrival of Donald Trump in the White House for a second term, redoubling his efforts in that arena.
Simon Bouvier, Monocle's Paris Bureau Chief, thank you very much for joining us here in the studio. You are listening to The Briefing. Here is Carlotta Rebello with the day's other headlines.
Thanks, Andrew. Russia launched a major new attack on Ukraine's energy infrastructure overnight, forcing the country to implement emergency power outages. Authorities were warning people on Friday morning to remain indoors amid fears of further drone and ballistic missile strikes. Insurgents in Myanmar have claimed control of the country's western border with Bangladesh. The ruling military junta's forces withdrew after clashes in the northern Rakhine state. It marks the first border area to fall into insurgent hands in the country's ongoing civil war. And U.S. plane maker Boeing is investing $1 billion to boost production of its 787 Dreamliner, to boost output and reach a target of producing 10 wide-body jets per month by 2026. The investment will go to its South Carolina facility and create 500 jobs at the manufacturing plant. Those are the day's headlines. Back to you, Andrew.
Thank you, Carlotta. You are listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio, and France's government is not the only French institution which will shortly be run by someone new after some months of speculation as to who will get the nod. Chanel has named its new creative director. It is Mathieu Blasi, presently doing the same job at Bottega Veneta. He will start at Chanel in the new year with a first collection due next October. And joining me with more on this is Monocle's fashion director, Natalie Theodosi. Natalie, is this appointment a surprise? I mean, this is a job that a lot of people want, right?
It is a little bit of a surprise. Like you said, there's been speculation for months, and every few weeks there would be another report about a different name interviewing for the job, being close to signing. And interestingly, Mathieu's name wasn't one on the top of the list of all those speculations. But I think it is a great choice, and it does make a lot of sense given what he has achieved at Bottega Veneta and his real commitment and interest in the world of craft.
I mean, Chanel, obviously a venerable brand, is very protective of its image and its heritage, etc. Is it unusual for them to recruit from outside, especially at such a senior level?
It is, and after Coco Chanel, Karl Lagerfeld had taken the house over for decades. When he passed away, Virginie Viard, who was working as his right hand for years and years, took over. So there was more of a natural continuation. It's the first time that someone brand new with a very different perspective is coming in to rehaul the house. That's why I think there was so much speculation and so much talk about who will get this job. But at the same time, I think, like Bruno Pavlovsky, the president of fashion, said, they are ready to be transported. They didn't hire someone to just continue what they've been doing, but to bring in a new perspective and modernism and change things up a little bit. So I think as long as everyone has an open mind, it's exciting. And Mathieu Blazy is someone that can bring in this change without being disrespectful to a brand, I think. So I'm optimistic that he's going to strike a great balance.
Well, we'll talk a bit shortly about what he might actually do, but just in terms of what you're taking on as a creative director, how big a leap up is it from a house like Bottega Veneta to Chanel?
It's a huge leap. Even though Bottega Veneta is a very established name, it's a much younger business. It's owned by Kering, but even scale-wise, we're talking about triple the size. He will have an atelier of 150 people to work with, and many more collections. So now he does 2 shows per year. He will now have to deliver ready-to-wear as well as haute couture. Think about destination shows, working with bigger campaigns, bigger budgets. So it's a huge leap and a big job. And hopefully he's up to the task.
Well, indeed. But when you come to an organisation like Chanel, how much freedom do you actually have to operate and to rethink? Is there an expectation, or at least has there traditionally been an expectation, that whoever comes in, there is a Chanel way of doing things, and that is the way that they will be done?
Well, I think they're going to have to figure things out, because this is the first time that someone new is coming in after decades, and there will have to be a new way of doing things. But of course, like I said, it's a balance, and it's a house that has some of the most recognizable codes that it's impacted fashion, but society at large as well. So it will be a push and pull, I think, where you have to work with these incredible artisans and designers in the studio that have been there for decades, and they know the brand and they have incredible expertise. But at the same time, there is a reason why Virginie Viard didn't stay and they didn't continue this evolution. They wanted a fresh perspective and someone new. So it's about him being respectful, and the design studio and the Chanel executive team being open to his ideas and what he has to offer.
Well, just finally then, based on what we know of his work to this point, what would you be expecting that he might try and bring to Chanel? How he might try to shape it in his own image a little bit?
To me, he's one of the most interesting designers at the moment. Whenever I would go to his shows at Bottega Veneta, I was always mesmerized. Usually, when you are watching a show, you see people looking at their phone, taking pictures. You can be easily distracted. While when you look at his work, it's so transportive, and it's rare these days. And I think he strikes a perfect balance of doing things that touch pop culture. There's a bit of humor, but there's also real craft and real ideas. He focuses on design rather than the gimmick. I think that's what he's going to bring onto Chanel. And he's going to have a lot more to play with, a lot more ateliers, a lot more craft expertise. So I expect to see that the Chanel codes revitalized, a lot of innovation in terms of what they do with fabric, with textile, with embellishment and craft. He at Bottega Veneta, one of his signature things was to use leather but make it look like denim. To play with their signature interwoven structures and really create some of the most incredible high-value pieces. So we'll see a lot more of that. And I think the Chanel customers who are looking for buying a piece every season, buying the next thing, and there's such loyalty there, they're going to be excited and they're going to want to keep growing their collections.
Natalie Theodosi, Monocle's fashion director, thank you for joining us. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. This is The Briefing on Monocle Radio. Morocco has never been entirely short of tourists, but it is currently celebrating record numbers. 15.9 million visitors in the year ending November 2024, a year-on-year increase of a thumping 20%. Morocco hopes to continue ramping up towards 2030, when it will co-host the World Cup with Portugal and Spain. I'm joined with more on this by Mary Fitzgerald, Monocle's North Africa correspondent. Mary, as far as it's possible to tell, and obviously not that there's any reason why loads of people shouldn't go to Morocco, is there any discernible reason for this sudden spike?
Well, I've been digging into some of the data behind this, and one of the fascinating aspects of this that I discovered is actually a huge chunk of these numbers are Moroccan diaspora. Basically, they're drawn from the significant Moroccan diaspora in France, in Belgium, in the Netherlands, basically choosing to holiday in the country of their origin, of their heritage. So I find that fascinating. And then looking at the other nationalities, I think it won't surprise anybody that the French are up there and the Spanish in terms of the leading nationalities visiting Morocco. This is good news for Morocco in that, we all remember the terrible earthquake in 2023 that it killed thousands of people and really traumatized the country. But also in recent years, there have been a couple of attacks, terrorist attacks inside the country that also kind of dented tourism numbers. So it's really, it's really a case of Morocco bouncing back. And as you said, ahead of co-hosting with Spain and Portugal the 2030 World Cup. There's a lot of discussion in Morocco right now in terms of, the infrastructure that is required before 2030, because while Morocco has long been a very popular tourist destination, it is true that it has infrastructural challenges. So that's going to be a real focus of the Moroccan authorities over the next years.
Notwithstanding those very sporadic terror attacks to which you refer, has Morocco also benefited, I guess, from acquiring a reputation as a Middle Eastern/North African country that it's reasonably easy to get to and you're reasonably safe in once you're there?
For sure. I think that has been part of the kind of subtle narrative, if you like, that Morocco has attempted to present to the world. Also, Morocco, has been the backdrop for several movies, TV series, all of that. That has also kind of spun this narrative of this is a country that's easy to get to, easy to visit when you're there, easy to travel around, relatively speaking, compared to other countries in the region. And the cultivation of tourism. If you look at other countries in North Africa, obviously Tunisia is the other big tourist destination, but Algeria and Libya, both for very different reasons, remain off limits for tourism.
Do we know if much work has been done to address one of the hazards of visiting Morocco, which is certainly in places like Casablanca and Marrakesh, getting pestered far beyond a joke by various merchants and other people? I mean, I know it's a much more serious thing for women than and for men it's usually just merely irritating past a certain point. But I've certainly spoken to many women who've had much more unpleasant experiences than over-enthusiastic carpet sellers.
Yes, indeed. And, while the over-enthusiastic carpet sellers, as you say, might be considered part of the charm of a visit to Morocco by some. For sure, what you mentioned, more seriously, harassment of female tourists remains an issue, remains a challenge. Different views in terms of whether that issue has gotten worse in recent years or has improved, but that is definitely a challenge and definitely something that a lot of female visitors report.
And do we think, finally, Morocco is also, I guess, a bit concerned about becoming a victim of its own success in a way that much touristed countries often do? And we have, of course, seen in various parts of Europe, in recent months especially, protests against tourists, people literally holding up signs saying tourists go home. Do you get the sense that they're trying to get as many people as possible to come, or is there some idea at, in play of, I guess, trying to keep something of a limit on it?
There is a discussion in Morocco about this, about the question of over-tourism, about the question of mass tourism and the kind of tourism that would have kind of developed, say, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, particularly the coastal resorts. Morocco is very focused on sustainability. At present, it's been embracing renewables more than any other country in North Africa. And so that kind of feeds into this question of what would sustainable tourism look like in Morocco. And there have definitely been moves towards that. It's an ongoing conversation. I think what will be interesting in the years leading up to the World Cup, given the infrastructural challenges I mentioned earlier and what will need to be done in order for Morocco to host the games, this question of what is sustainable in terms of infrastructure. Just this week, there was a major investment announced for the coastal city of Essaouira, and that development, it's going to be over $400 million worth. Major development. The UAE is involved. Naguib Sawiris, the Egyptian investor, is involved. And, Essaouira, which I have to say I love and will be spending Christmas in this year, it's a small little town. It has a particular vibe. It's very unique. It's not as frenetic as Marrakesh, for example. And in Essaouira, in recent years, there has been this conversation about what kind of tourism the town wants to maintain. Does it want to maintain that kind of, intimate, laid-back vibe, or does it want something a bit more flashy that would draw more tourists and a particular type of tourist? So yes, it's an ongoing debate.
Mary Fitzgerald, thank you as always for joining us. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. This is The Briefing on Monocle Radio. Time now for a roundup of news from the world of arts and culture. And for that, we are joined now in the studio by the arts journalist Amar Rose Abrams. Sorry, I got it right the second time. How are you?
I'm very well, thanks. How are you?
I'm very well, give or take the inability to pronounce words of two syllables. I'm blaming last night's Christmas party. We should start with Sotheby's, where it turns out nobody is bidding on anything.
No, I mean, there's been a general slump in the art market, but Sotheby's seems to be feeling it the hardest. And I mean, there's lots of reasons for that, I think. But I mean, they've just announced huge global cuts, staffing cuts. And apparently this is including back office workers, junior workers, but also top level specialists. So really the top of the tree in auctioneers and things like that. It's a huge cull of staff. And across London and New York mostly, but it's a global situation. They're cutting people everywhere.
You mentioned the reasons behind this. What are they? Why the sudden tapering of interest in... I mean, this is obviously very high-end auctions, but is there a particular, I guess, consensus on why there's a dip?
I think it's to do with market confidence. the general atmosphere in the world, people not feeling like they want to spend £100 million on an artwork just now. And I think, obviously, it's not just the £100 million pieces that Sotheby's and these auction houses deal in. They have auctions that run all year round of different kind of varying levels of expense. And I just think the market for these high-level luxury purchases is just not as big as it was in our current climate. And in addition to that, for Sotheby's, they've just accepted a £1 million minority stake from the Abu Dhabi Sovereign Wealth Fund, which happened just before all these cuts were announced. And this is it follows a majority stakeholder, which is Patrick Jarahi. He owns most of Sotheby's, and he has very publicly got £60 billion worth of debt that he needs to address. And but the interesting thing about this is, I think, that while they've cut back on staff, they have doubled down on real estate because they have just secured a long-term lease of the Breuer building in New York. Obviously, it was the Met Breuer. And then the Whitney was also been in this building. You know, it's a huge, very expensive building. And so while they're cutting back in some areas, they're clearly spending in others.
Well, we should look closer to London actually in London, and a change of leadership at the Chisenhale.
Yes, the Chisenhale, one of the few institutions we have in the UK, which is based around experimentation, inviting artists in to do highly conceptual works. It's very much about the kind of emerging artists, the pushing the boundaries, very conceptual artwork. And Zoe Whitley, who people may know because she curated Soul of a Nation, a highly influential show at the Tate Modern where she used to work. And it basically has dictated so many trends for the last, she did that in 2017, and it platformed artists like Frank Bowling, who now is almost a kind of household name. People hadn't really heard about him before. She's very, very kind of eminent and respected curator. And she has said in her kind of statement as she leaves that, she's talked about the pressures of art leadership. And she's a great figure. I hope she stays in the UK. She's originally from the US. But essentially, she wants to be independent. She wants to be freelance. And she's saying, it's very difficult to lead institutions in the UK at the moment. I assume she's kind of hinting towards budget cuts and the general kind of atmosphere around the arts at the moment and funding.
Well, we should look finally at an event which I do hope we'll come back to once we get a sense of how this is going to work. This is the Gaza Biennale, which for depressingly obvious reasons will not be taking place in Gaza. So how is it actually going to work?
I think they've gathered, it's in collaboration with the Forbidden Museum, and since April they've been gathering together a list of artists, for about 50 artists they've got now in and outside of Gaza. And they're looking for partners, they're looking for institutional partners, they're looking for funding, and they're looking for people to host exhibitions around the world of art made in Gaza over the last few months. And I think they are looking for donations to try and raise money to back this up, but they're also looking to maybe draw funding in via institutional partnerships. So I guess then the money would be going through these institutions and then they could host these shows. So then it's not as if all the money they're asking for is just directly to be sent to them. And there seems to be quite a lot of take-up. They've had some funding. They've managed to raise some of their funding. The goal is €90,000. And I hope, as you do, that they can pull it off. I think there's obviously a lot of kind of warmth towards making it happen. There are issues, I guess, with getting the artwork out of Gaza. But I guess it would be a wonderful thing if they can bring it to fruition.
Indeed so. Amar Rose Abrams, thank you very much for joining us. You are listening to The Briefing. And And finally on today's show, the album AOK Disco, Boogie, Pop and Funk from the South China Sea is the latest release from the independent label Soundway Records, curated by Alice Whittington, also known as DJ Nausicaa. The album is a compilation of disco, funk, city pop and synth tracks from the 1970s and 1980s and highlights the ways in which Southeast Asian countries were establishing a new national identity post-independence, as well as the burgeoning music industry in the region at the time. To discuss the album and the accompanying zine that documents the history and discoveries made along the way of producing it, Alice joined Monocle's Maylee Evans in the studio here at Midori House.
My mother is Malaysian, and I've spent a lot of time in Malaysia with my family out there. And a very long time ago, I just started buying records at the bottom of department stores in basement bins and that kind of thing, with no sort of clear direction other than I just really liked these sounds that I was picking up, and I just couldn't find it anywhere else outside of Asia. It was just not a popular genre or region of music for quite a long time. But I feel like probably in the last 5-10 years, with the rise of K-pop and a lot of Japanese culture and a little bit more accessibility to Southeast Asia as well, that people outside of Asia are finally starting to see it as having some value. About 5 years ago, when I was in lockdown, was doing a lot of live streams with the Vinyl Factory and a couple of other platforms, and did quite a few Asian-specific mixes, which resounded really well, especially because a lot of people of Asian origin were experiencing a lot of hate during that time. I just thought there's something there. I feel like it's connecting to a community that I hadn't been connected to before.
The focus for this record is sort of from the mid-70s to the late 80s. You're bringing these tracks together, all coming from totally different areas, local labels. What was that like, trying to find these people? Were they still making music? Were these labels still running? What was that search like?
It was really difficult, to be totally honest, because firstly there's a language barrier, and trying to get hold of these different releases and labels and work out whether they still existed, even that they were still going. A lot of them went bust or defunct or were bought out by majors. All the countries in this compilation and the scene have a border with the South China Sea, or what you would call that body of water that is contestable among some countries. At the time, that's what it was called during the 70s and 80s. You would see all those countries bordering that, and they had a lot of cross-pollination between each other once air travel in the 70s really started to become more affordable. Yeah, it's been a journey discovering not just the music, but then all the history that went behind it. That's how the whole concept came together, was the realization that actually, as much as they're all very different countries and cultures and languages, that they all have a lot of common history.
In that time, a lot of these countries were newly independent, and so at that moment they are forging their own identity. What were those sort of first inklings like?
It was fascinating because independence is a difficult thing to achieve, not just as a government, but as an identity, I think. Everyone's got their own idea of what independence is and identity is, and a lot of these governments that were coming into power straight after independence had a specific, or at least a direction that they wanted to go in, but the populace didn't necessarily agree with that. So there was actually a lot of censorship, especially in Indonesia and Singapore. They were trying to create their own identity, to celebrate their roots and heritage, and simultaneously reject a lot of Western ideas because of colonialism, and yet at the same time, the economic boom and the way that the general citizens were embracing new technology and a lot of Western culture as well, you know, through entertainment and that kind of thing, was a real power struggle between a lot of these governments and the people.
Habibi, 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 ya Habibi, 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 ya Habibi.
There's Ahmadi Hassan, who is a Malaysian artist, Islamic artist, and his track is Habibi, Mari Bersatu, where he actually is pleading with the Malaysian people to come together and to unite in spirit of independence, but also as progression. Instead of everyone bickering over what the national identity should be, he's trying to say, let's celebrate all our different identities and move forward and create this one whole.
In the record, you've got a range of different genres. Was this something you kind of knew was going to be part and parcel of doing this project?
Definitely started off with disco because it was more popular in my mixes and DJ sets. As I started digging further and further into the labels and the artists that were creating this music, they had so many other genres and influences that were coming through, and it just felt a little reductive to reduce it to one. There's a bit of fuzzy rock on there as well, and city pop. It's not so much a genre-specific compilation as it is an ideals compilation. So all of these songs are very hopeful. They're very celebratory. They're also searching through their own languages and instruments and traditions to create this new identity.
That was Alice Whittington talking to Monocle's Maylee Evans. The album AOK Disco, Boogie, Pop and Funk from the South China Sea is out now. You can listen to the full interview with Alice on the Monocle Weekly, which you can find at monocle.com. And that is all for this edition of The Briefing. It was produced by Chris Chermak and Anita Riota. Our researcher was Maisie Ringer and our studio manager was Alan Whedon, with editing assistance from Elliot Greenfield. The Briefing returns on Monday at the same time. I'm Andrew Muller. I'll be back with The Daily at 1800. For now, thanks for listening.